We would certainly not have acted like the Israeli Defense Forces have to date. They've used weapons which are completely disproportionate, dumb bombs. You're talking about 2,000-pound bombs. We would absolutely not have done that. When in doubt about a target in terms of the possibility of a number of civilians being killed, we would simply not engage.
Now, a British diplomat has resigned from the Foreign Office, saying that the department may be complicit in war crimes for continuing to allow arms sales to Israel. Mark Smith, who used to work in arms exports to the Middle East, wrote in a resignation letter to colleagues that members of the Israeli government and military have expressed open genocidal intent. The Foreign Office says that it is committed to upholding international law, but there was an ongoing process to assess whether Israel is complying with it. Well, the former Brigadier John Deverell, who was a senior British officer in the Palestinian territories and Director of Defence Diplomacy in the MOD, joins me now. Thank you so much for joining us, Brigadier Deverell. First of all, words like genocide, I mean, they exist as a lingua franca, but they have a specific meaning in law. And in terms of what's happening in Gaza, it has not yet been determined. This is not an opinion from me. This is a matter of legal fact, whether it is genocide or not. Is that correct?
Well, I would, Ruth, thank you for having me. I would look at it more simply in a more basic way, which is to do with the law of armed conflict, also known as international humanitarian law. And regarding those, I think Mark Smith has taken not only a very principled and morally courageous position, but also a position which makes it clear that these civil servants, such as him, are under a lot of pressure because they are arguably complicit in violations of international humanitarian law.
And in terms of his resignation and making sure that it was, he publicly wrote to other civil servants that are working in the MOD. I mean, the intent there, what do you think? To get others to resign, to change government policy, to bring, scrutiny from and sort of media analysis from players like ourselves?
I would say that there are very many people like him who feel in the same way. He will have immense tacit support. But of course, for people to give up their jobs in order to make public statements like this is much more difficult, and therefore his position, in a way, is one which is morally extremely courageous. I also know that people doing similar jobs across in State Department in the US also are in a similar position. So Josh Paul resigned very, very publicly a number of months ago on exactly the same issue because Americans working in this area of arms sales and arms licenses, arms export licenses, feel the same way. I think, in a way, Ruth, what's important to look at is the position of the British government in this. The new British government has said it's looking very seriously at this. And we did expect that there would be an announcement before the parliamentary recess that the British government was going to stop arms sales of certain natures. That has not yet happened. And of course, the British government is in danger, therefore, of breaking its own laws and also international laws on this subject. I think what's interesting to note is the positions of individual British government departments. For instance, trade and industry, they would be predisposed to continue to provide weapons components to Israel, as would the Ministry of Defence.
Can I ask you a question as a former senior UK military commander who knows both the way government thinks and the way the armed forces think? If a hostile state had crossed the UK's sovereign borders and killed 1,200 people, civilian people, and had abducted and forcibly removed several hundred more, do you think that the UK's response would have been materially different to that response of Israel?
100%. As a former senior military operational planner as well, I know that to be a fact. We ourselves have a genuinely stringent process which involves...
We wouldn't have sought militarily to go into where we believed and intelligence showed us those hostages were held and remove them and seize them back, no?
We would, by our own rules, Ruth, have been extremely constrained in what weaponry we used. We would have used only very precise weapons. We would have used incontrovertible intelligence. The Israelis have not done those things, and we would certainly not have acted like the Israeli Defense Forces have to date. They've used weapons which are completely disproportionate, dumb bombs. You're talking about 2,000-pound bombs. We would absolutely not have done that. When in doubt about a target in terms of the possibility of a number of civilians being killed, we would simply not engage.
Okay. In terms of the value of arms licenses, it's I think the latest figures that we have are from last year, which is 18.2 million, which, in terms of sort of ordinary people's money, that's a lot of money. In terms of what weaponry costs, it's a minute amount of weaponry that we sell them. And we have our own rules, don't we, regarding our export licenses that have to be scrutinised at every point.
We do have our own rules, and I was indeed party to those sort of decisions when I was myself working in MOD some time ago, and also we're bound by international rules. It's not just us. So I would also argue, Ruth, that the amount of weaponry we provide is not material in this regard. So even if whether we're producing 10% or less than 1% doesn't matter. The point is the law still applies. So even if one puts aside the moral and the human arguments, which I feel are also important, we are breaking, I would argue, and many would argue, we are breaking our own laws. I can imagine that what will happen in the future months is there will be a court decision which will go against the British government. Our own internal case will be brought against the British government. It will probably go exactly as it did with weapons to Saudi Arabia over the Yemen conflict. And I would anticipate that the British government will be found to be in breach, and that a judge at the top level will order, within our own country, will order the British government to stop providing export licenses for certain components. Absolutely.
For certain components, I'm sorry, I don't know if you have enough oversight to be able to explain likely what is, in your view, sort of at contest here, and in terms of what we sell.
Absolutely. So Ruth, one's looking at two things, not only the conflict in Gaza, but also the recent ICJ, International Criminal Court, judgment about the illegality of the occupation, which also includes the West Bank. And countries such as ourselves who sign up to ICJ proceedings also are therefore potentially in breach of our agreement if we continue to support in any way the occupation of the West Bank. So that also includes weaponry and military equipment used by the IDF there as well. So if you look at it more widely, there is a real concern. Now, the British government has a particular concern over the F-35 because we are contractually involved in providing parts for the F-35. And of course, that's
the fast jet, isn't it? That's the military plane.
Correct, absolutely. And we use that. The IDF uses that. It's mainly an American aircraft, but we provide components for that under contract. And of course, a court judgment could well go against us continuing to provide those components. And that could be a real worry for the British government, which is probably one reason why the British government has been somewhat slow about coming forward since the change of government to say, look, we need to stop doing this. Another, looking at it in detail, Ruth, another consideration is whether or not a future court sitting would decide whether or not this also would apply to weapons licenses, export licenses, which are already in place. And arguably that should also happen, but let's wait for a court process. I think a sensible government would preempt that in order to make sure that the reputational damage of a judgment going against the British government didn't take place.
Okay, well, Luke, thank you so much for joining us this morning. That's former Brigadier John Deverell there, who was a senior British officer in the Palestinian territories and also a former Director of Defence Diplomacy. Lots, it sounds like, is going to be in that court judgment.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Ruth. Labour have got in with we're going to be talking to a protester, to Kamala Harris, after 8 o'clock, and she is saying she wants an arms embargo from the US, which would materially affect Israel's ability to survive in the region, you would imagine. A British arms embargo makes virtually no difference. Do you think a British government, elected with a base that is broadly pro-Palestinian,
and with a Foreign Secretary in David Lammy, who said things on the record that have been, that have not found favour within Israel, and there have been, issues about meetings with him, etc., because of those historic and current things. So, I think that the new government's going to have to walk a very difficult. I mean, I don't envy Keir Starmer's entry either at home or abroad right now. I mean, this is a pretty difficult world to be navigating in. When, apart from Yvette Cooper, how many people have ever been in government before?